We have a poem by Mei-mei Berssenbrugge called Concordance. You can get it in a book called I Love Artists, New and Selected Poems, Mei-mei Berssenbrugge. Mei-mei was born in Beijing, China, to a Chinese mom and I believe, Dutch-American father. And she lived in China for just a year or so and then moved to the United States. And the poem is called Concordance. And we're going to listen to Mei-mei Berssenbrugge read the first section, the first part of this poem. It's in 4 parts, or maybe it's in 3 parts. We're going to read the first section. It's a very difficult poem. I think we'll have plenty to talk about listening to the first section. And you have to hear Mei-mei read it. It's so part of the meaning of it. So here we go.
Writing encounters one who does not write, and I don't try for him, but face to face draw you onto a line or flight like a break that may be extended, the way milkweed filling space above the field is like reading. Then it's possible to undo misunderstanding from inside by tracing the flight or thread of empty space running through things, even a relation that's concordant. Seeds disperse in summer air. Sun rays cease to represent parallel passages in a book that is not coming from what I see and feel. Relation is in the middle, relay, flower description to flower becoming of my eye between light and heart. Now information has released imaginative function from authors. I send an interrupted line over the top of space, past the middle cinematically, when you can no longer stand what you put up with before. At night part of her numbed to pain and part wote to what occurred. Working backward in sleep, the last thing you numbed to is what wakes you. What if that image were eros as words? I write to you and you feel me. What would it be like if you contemplated my words and I felt you? Animals, an owl, frog, open their eyes, and a mirror forms on the ground. When insight comes in a dream and events the next day illuminate it, this begins your streaming consciousness, synchronicity, asymptotic lines of the flights of concordances. An owl opens its eyes in deep woods. For the first time I write, and you don't know me. Milkweed I touch floats.
So let's start with this idea on the second page of this section. I write to you and you feel me. What would it be like if you contemplated my words and I felt you? What's radical about that idea? Max, what's radical? That's a very unusual way of thinking about this, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, it's unusual for most people. It's maybe a little less unusual in the context of ModPo. But since I feel like we've kind of touched on these concepts before, but the way that she is thinking about it here, I think, is not like we've seen it before. And she's really concerned with this sort of reversal of just things kind of coming from inside, going outwards, or the events of the next day somehow like then reinforming the dream you had the night before. These kinds of like reversals of causation or reversals in time. And here you have something like I as the poet, naturally I'm going to be writing something and it's going to touch you, the reader, when you read it. But like, what if then I had this sort of like on the other end this frisson of like oh, you read my work or something like that. And it's really cool. Like just and it's
imagining a receptivity of the writer in response to the recipient, the reader, receiving it. So a kind of concordance that we think of as not being possible. Why even, Gabe, what's the point of contemplating this kind of concordance, which is impossible?
Well, Berssenbrugge, I think of Berssenbrugge as like a phenomenologist, somebody who's trying to understand how experiences happen. What does it feel like to literally exist in the world and have experiences? And I think that she's kind of speculative about relationships in this. And that idea of like, which Max described as like frisson of like feeling somebody's reading your work. I think what's interesting to her about it is that it changes the directionality that we assume literature has, and it changes the direction that we think like ideas have, in which like an idea is sort of generated and then disseminated to people, and then they can kind of do whatever they want. I think Berssenbrugge is thinking like, what if my writing didn't just change you, but your interaction with it changed me? It's like a hope for a kind of like natural relation, and just because she thinks so much about nature, it's almost like a symbiotic coupling of the reader and the writer.
It's utopian.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, she hints at the utopian possibility of concordance in the second line. Her lines are long sentences that we can call stanzas, but I think lines is commonly what we say. The second line, then it's possible to undo misunderstanding from inside. That's utopian.
It's utopian, but it's speculative, and I think like this poem is very sort of disappointed sometimes about the speculation. Like those ending lines are so I feel that they seem disappointed. For the first time I write and you don't know me, milkweed I touch floats. And I think it's sensitive and speculative, but I don't think it's utopian in the sense of like, this is what's happening.
Right. It's not programmatic in that sense. Okay, others. I'm curious to know what others think of this potential revision in the relationship of writer and reader, or writer and recipient. I'm going to, while you're thinking about this, just sort of outline where we might have gotten here. So, phase one, writer knows, writer writes, writer got it all figured out, delivers book or poem unto reader, reader receives, either gets it or doesn't get it. Fuck you, reader, if you don't get it. Phase one. And that's what most people think literary writing is, to this day. Okay. Phase two, and this encompasses all of modernism and part of what happens after modernism, which is, let's say, in the best circumstance at the very end, my life, Lynn Heginian, I write and I need you to do the work to help me figure out what my life means. Because I don't know, but I will give you the basics and you'll be able to do a lot of work. That's phase two. Mei-mei Berssenbrugge is taking that Heginian idea and pushing it further, at least in concordance, to try to imagine how the writer-reader relationship would be purely egalitarian. That is to say, either one could be in the role of the other at any point. So, Lily, what do you think of all this?
I think when we get the line in the first page on our printout, I send an interrupted line over the top of space, past the middle cinematically, when you can no longer stand what you put up with before. I read that as Mei-mei diagramming like what she thinks is a less than ideal or like a broken way that authors and readers communicate with each other. Like this idea of you can no longer stand what you put up with before, of like that there's a presentation more than a relation. Like I send it up, you've got, okay, you're looking at it, and then and then I send up another one and you're looking at it. Whereas like what she would really prefer is this type of relation that she outlines where you read and then it actually might change something about me, later on, and then you eventually won't even know who I am at all because you've read, I've changed, written again. You've read, I've changed, written again.
What do you think, Davey? What's happening here? And I bet you're interested in the long, long, long lines that are almost horizons.
I'm interested in the long lines, and I'm also interested in thinking about this as like maybe not a revision of a relationship between reader and writer, but maybe a restoration. And there are a couple of moments that make me especially curious about that. In this first stanza, the way milkweed filling space above the field is like reading, and on this, and later on, animals and owl frog open their eyes and a mirror forms in the ground. And there's something that the language of numbness appears, being numb to pain, appears that makes me curious about this poem being interested in a kind of like acute attention. That's something that a human reader has lost. That the reason we might read a poem is to think about ourselves in relation in a really urgent and intimate way, and to recognize that our being in relation is something that, like, a species level failure, perhaps.
So there was a time of alienation,
Sure.
but prior to that was a concordance, a natural concordance.
So, following the logic of the poem, I think the poem thinks so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I think according to the poem, that like reading might help us.
This poem and many others by Mei-mei.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. Restore a mode of attention as a kind of like ecological intimacy.
Molly, what do you think?
I'm looking on the first page at that line, relation is in the middle. Relay flower description to flower, like talking about the thing to the thing. The relation is in the middle is this like turning inwards of, I think, reader and writer looking at each other.
Can
And then
you paraphrase relation is in the middle? This is hard. What is being said exactly?
that two entities have to meet each other halfway, right? Both parties have to be doing the work to be able to have relation, to have a relationship and intimacy.
So relation is a third space. Amber Rose?
I was just excited about that idea.
Yeah.
I mean,
third space is a really, really generative concept. Maybe we should bring it in.
Yeah, it makes me think about, anytime I think about relation, I'm thinking about Glissant, who says, when speaking of relation, you no longer have to say between what and what.
Right.
And so there's a way that when you're dealing with relation, actually the two ends or the two finite subjects are no longer important. What's important is this sort of other thing that happens. But a line that I was really excited about, thinking back to Davy's point about restoration, is now information has released imaginative function from authors. And that line to me is interesting because you would sort of assume that the author has the information, following that line that Lily read, the author has the information that they're sending to the reader. But there's something, in a way, that sort of to put the author in that kind of dominant position also takes away their imaginative function. So there's something about the author also not having information, or having their information be questioned or changed by relation with someone else, that restores some other kind of possibility for them too.
I want to return to third space, but let's digress a little bit, Anna, on the voice, Mei-mei Berssenbrugge's signature voice. We have a poet like Ginsberg who felt that the energy and emphasis is going to do the work that the poem requires. We have a poet like John Ashbery who read in what seems to have been a deliberate monotone because he didn't really want to inflect the poems. He wanted them just to sort of tumble forth. What's happening with Mei-mei Berssenbrugge's voice, and how does it fit the poems?
I think Berssenbrugge's vocal performance would be more aligned with Ashbery's, in that sense of I'm not going to inflect any more or less than the poem's line sort of like ask me to. The long horizontal line, we're not worrying about an attention to like line breaks or dashes or things like that. We're really just, each line kind of reads like a declarative statement sentence, which is awesome. And that allows like the flattest possible space for us as readers to enter. and do this participatory work that she's inviting us to.
Anybody else want to comment on the voice, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, to me it sounds so incredibly gentle. It almost sounds like ASMR, you know, like she's just whispering to you, like in the most sort of lulling way possible.
You're not the first one to say that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
commonly said.
And which makes sense, I think, given her content here, where she's offering care to a reader, but also requesting care. So that gentleness makes a space for that.
Let's go back to the beginning to talk about the possibility of undoing misunderstanding. What is misunderstanding in the context of this theorizing about the relationship of a maker of meaning and a recipient of meaning? Let's go back to basics. Dave, what's misunderstanding generally? Not in this poem, but generally.
Oh, when it's a failure of communication, which is what I sort of got out of this concept. I once had a guitar teacher who said, sometimes the notes you don't play are more important than the ones you do. That makes me think about the difference between communication and expression. Like a guitarist like Jerry Garcia is all over the place and kind of sloppy, but he expresses and there's space between his notes and it's a little sloppy, and that allows this open channel, I guess this third space, where there actually can be an expression. The pure communication, which seems to be what's sort of being criticized here, is that traditional notion, that one-way notion. You know, here's information. Information has released imaginative function from authors. When it becomes a communicative process, it's just one way. Opening it up, creating this negative space, allows there to be an expression, a give and take.
Good, that's a good start. So, Allie, turning to you. So, in the original formulation of the writer who means and the reader who either gets it or doesn't, then misunderstanding is, as Dave described it, you didn't get what I wrote. It's on you. But in the second world, the second space, there's the space of Hegelianian, that's the adjective, Hegelianian. A misunderstanding is where intersubjectivity isn't aligning itself. But in this third space, misunderstanding would be the failure to meet, Amber Rose, help me meet in the middle that relation creates. And if you're not willing to occupy that space that's not you, but is shared with someone else, then that in itself is kind of a process misunderstanding. Does any of this make any sense to you?
Yeah, I'm coming back to the line relation is in the middle, but towards the end of it. Flower description to flower becoming of my eye between light and heart. And at least for me, like what that is getting to is, especially in a poem that is concerned with the relationship between writer and reader and communication, it's like that becoming of my eye between light and heart is such an intimate, unwordable experience. That and it's animal, right? Like it's a sort of intimacy, or the desire to communicate or share a type of intimacy, or almost like, you know, if you have like two particles of water, or not particles, but like drops of water, and they merge. That's kind of like how I imagine the desire here. And at the end, someone kind of hinted at this, but for the first time I write and you don't know me, milkweed I touch floats. For me, especially because we get just like some hints of like pain about like someone who's being discussed, that feels like such a loss. That what Emily was saying in terms of like, this is a writer who is requesting some sort of care as well. And it kind of flips this way we have of thinking about writing as like a substitute for someone who is no longer there. Like writing as legacy, writing as like something left over when that writer is gone. And here, going back to those two lines, I write you and you feel me, what would it be like if you contemplated my words and I felt you? If we look at that, contemplating a potential or possible loss that this poem is talking about, what would it be like if, having written to you, I could still feel you as my listener or reader after you're gone.
Terrific, thank you. So we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to invite some or all of you to pick a phrase, an image, a line that you want to add into the conversation from this section that will permit you to say one more point. We don't have time for everybody, but I'd love to get a few thoughts on this. Gabe, is there a phrase that you underlined and thought, wow, that's pretty cool?
There are many phrases that I underlined and thought were pretty cool, but actually I think most helpful might be just like tracking the word I here, E-Y-E, not the letter I. Because so that middle line on the first page of it, relation is in the middle, relay. Flower description to flower, becoming of my eye between light and heart. The I, which appears again in the animals, an owl, frog open their eyes, and later an owl opens its eyes and do both. The I seems to be the site of relation, because Berssenbrugge points out here that the middle, which is the relation, is between the flower description and the flower, and the way the flower is perceived by the eye and then becoming a thing that can be described, so between the light and the heart. And that I seems to be the point at which relation happens. And that's a thing of reading, because reading is an operation of the I. So she's really thinking about like the way in which reading has this kind of tendency to kind of like take an object and make it into a description, which is also the operation of writing. And I feel like we're missing something. And something I'm not grasping at just yet. But the I appears again with the owl and the frog. Part of me wants to say that this Berssenbrugge poem, like other Berssenbrugge poems, wants to say that nature is sort of always more surprising than reading is, and that she wishes that wasn't the case. There we go.
That last thought leads me to my line, so I'm waiting for the rest of you to pick out your lines, which is not from this section, it's from the third section. But what you just said about nature, surprising, more interesting than writing, she writes, when I hear ants are telepathic, I see tiny words trying to communicate. I don't know if that needs explaining, but this idea, well, ants are sort of famously, from our point of view, famously communitarian and species-oriented as opposed to individualistic. If they are tiny words trying to communicate, presumably to us, then communication itself is a species-wide thing. And if we reframe it to be a species-wide thing, then we can kind of realize some of these dreams and see in nature not just the surprise of it being more complicated than language, but it is a kind of language that we just need to learn how to read. All right. Line, you got a line, Max?
Yeah. I was looking at the line "seeds disperse in summer air,"
Yes.
Which is not necessarily the most exciting line in this poem, but I think that's what makes it interesting. It's this very obvious image for the circulation and distribution of literature or ideas or whatever it is that she's talking about at the beginning. But it becomes that much more astonishing when you get to the end of the poem and you realize that what she's inviting you to do is to try to imagine the opposite of seeds dispersing in the summer air. And it's not just like playing that, little clip we all have in our heads, like in reverse, and seeing the seeds like go back to the flower or to the pod or wherever it is they're dispersing from. But it's something that's a lot more difficult to try and imagine, and it's cool. I don't know. I found myself just like wanting to think about that line in that context and try to imagine that reversal, and it's really hard.
The experience of reading Mei-mei Berssenbrugge, which I think all of us who've read a lot of her poems highly recommend, is a lot like that. You can take it one line at a time and scratch your head in the most exciting, pleasurable way. Lily, you got a line or phrase?
Yeah, I think for me, I keep coming back to this idea of like what's going on at night. At night, part of her numbed to pain and part of her woke to what occurred. Like, that's the image that doesn't seem to fit in this like nature imagery. And so I'm thinking like, what does numbness and numbing and, like to me it just speaks about, okay, if the seeds are dispersed in summer air, we're almost not seeing either one. They're in complete concordance. Not but like they are becoming part of each other. Like we maybe are becoming numbed one or the other. Yeah, I'm interested in this hovering around a line of like, are you asleep or are you numb or are you awake, and kind of like crests and troughs.
Great. We have time for one more. Who's got a phrase or a line that you'd like to throw in here? Everybody's being so abashed. Davey, you got one?
Yeah, the one that I've been thinking about in part because I can't totally assimilate it with the structure of this poem is in the second stanza, even a relation that's concordant. So it's possible to undo misunderstanding, ... even a relation that's concordant. That is making me interested in types of concordance, is making me think about concordance without procedure, and to think about a kind of multiplicity of concordances, the difference between being like synced up with something for the moment and able to follow it through a procedure, the way that like her like ideal form of reading is one that's a concordance that you hang on to, that's more or less opaque at different moments, that you're like engaged in the procedure of reading and able to make the opacity of reading something complex a form of concordance before it's a form of understanding. To withhold understanding or misunderstanding from what concordance might be, to sort of suspend the desire to understand as you read.
How many of you would agree with me if I said that one definition of concordance in this Berssenbruggean sense is love?
Yeah.
Sure.
Right? And I think of a poem by John Ashbery, The One Thing That Could Save America, where he and a partner living a gay life in New York, but then he's sort of imagining crossing the country, and so there's this bit of alienation, social alienation in it. And the point is that he turns to his partner in the morning in New York before the poem sets out on the country, and he says, there's once in a while, you know, when I say something and you really get me, which is his way of saying that's love. Love is communication that works. I think that's a somewhat simpler version of this, but here concordance is in the title of the book, of the selected poems, I Love Artists. The first line of this poem is, writing encounters someone who does not write, and I don't try for him. Possibly that is her very famous painter husband, the one who doesn't write but is an artist. I love artists. But possibly her trying to write is a way of loving, simply. So, anyway, thank you all for going at this poem. It's really rewarding, I think.